Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? I hope so. So today I'm going to talk to you about security on AWS. Okay, thank you, Kranti, for letting me know that you can properly hear me. So we'll be talking about improving security on AWS. I think most of you know that security is important, but so I'm just gonna hopefully give you some hints and tips on how to get started with improving it. So first of all, who am I? So I'm Stijn de Haas, the tech lead of Conveyor. So Conveyor is a product by DataMinded to make creating data pipelines easy. I'm also a partner at DataMinded. So for those who don't know, DataMinded is a consultancy firm which has the product Conveyor, and we also have Academy, where we learn developers and data engineers on basic topics like SQL, Python, etc., but also more advanced topics like Kubernetes. For the product Conveyor, I've been focused, or a big part of my focus has been improving security over the last year and making sure that we can prove that we are secure. So I've been looking at AWS, Azure, and Kubernetes. But so today we'll be talking about, mostly be talking about AWS. If you want to find out more about the Conveyor product, should go to datamind.com/conveyor to see more info, or send me a message via LinkedIn, or send me a message via LinkedIn. I think that's the easiest. First of all, why is security important? Well, the trigger for me to start this webinar was two articles I've read at tweakers.net. It's a Dutch tech website, and the first one was a ransomware attack on Casa. So Casa is a store in the Netherlands and Belgium, and they got hit by a ransomware attack. What is a ransomware attack? Basically, there is malware on your devices, on your computers, that encrypt the device itself. But they don't give you the decryption keys, of course. So basically, you cannot use your device. All your data is encrypted. And basically, if this happens to your whole IT organization, everything grinds to halt and you can't use your IT anymore. They were apparently able to stop it somewhere at the beginning, so they didn't have too much interference from it, but it's something that in the last 10 years has been happening more and more. The second article, a couple of days later, was a data breach at Authy. So Authy is a two-factor authentication app. So it's very security sensitive. They had a data breach. Actually, their parent company had a data breach, Twilio. And some of the data from users got accessed. Basically, these attacks can happen to any size of company at any time lately. They've been happening more and more. I also remember a ransomware attack on the biggest meat vendor in the US a year or 2 years back that just crippled them for weeks. And I think it's happening more and more. Most companies have sensitive data, some just on their business, some also have sensitive user data, and most businesses are increasingly reliant on IT systems. If your mail would fail tomorrow, then I think like half your business would be in trouble. And for me, I think it's a responsibility as a software engineer or as a data engineer to make my solutions as secure as possible. I know that more software engineers and data engineers aren't the security expert, me neither, but I think there's a lot of things that we can do, use automated solutions to help us with increasing the security of our solutions. So just a reminder of how AWS looks at the security responsibility model. So they use a shared responsibility model. This is typical for most clouds. So AWS divides it up into two, the things you are responsible for and the things AWS is responsible for. So you may or you may not know, AWS looks at it as they are responsible of the security of the cloud. You are responsible for the security in the cloud. So what does that mean? AWS typically is responsible for all the hardware and all the data centers and the infrastructure itself. So they will make sure that no unauthorized access to the servers can happen, etc. They also have a lot of responsibility regarding software. One of the basic software things, or one of the basic things that a cloud vendor provides is virtual machines. In AWS, that's EC2. And so to provide a virtual machine always runs on a physical server. So they will make sure that the physical server is secure, and they will make sure that the software used to manage that virtual machine is secure. So the hypervisor and all the APIs to start up virtual machines. But that's where their responsibility ends. You launch a virtual machine with an operating system. You are responsible for the choice of operating system, for keeping it up to date. And you are also responsible for every application you install in it. So you're responsible for quite a lot of things there. But there are services which make you have less responsibility. If we think about managed databases, so RDS, for example, at that point, if we spin up an RDS instance, we choose MySQL, Oracle, Postgres, or another version of SQL that they provide. And you basically get a connection string and you provide an admin username and password, and they will set that up for you. At that point, you are not responsible anymore for the operating system of that database. You are also not responsible for the software that is running on there, because AWS is managing all of that. You are only responsible for, if you create extra users on the SQL database, you need to manage their rights and their access. You are responsible for that. So depending on the service you use, your responsibility changes. And the more high-level services you use, the less you are responsible. But in the end, you are still responsible for configuring them correctly. So if we look at the blob storage in S3 bucket, you are responsible for configuring that S3 bucket correctly. If you set it open to the public and somebody downloads your sensitive data that you've put on a public bucket, that is your responsibility. You also need to turn on encryption on it. So you are responsible for that. Secondly, this is how I look a bit at how you can improve your security. So I look a bit of it look at it like it is timeline. So first of all, you want to do prevention. So you want to prevent something landing in production that is insecure. You can do this when a developer opens a pull request, for example. You can scan that if he added a library, you can check for known security vulnerabilities and stop that pull request from landing on the main branch. That's what you can do with prevention. There are other things around that. AWS doesn't focus so much on those kinds of services. But they do provide a lot of scanning services. And why is scanning useful? Well, you can't prevent what you don't know. So at some point, a new vulnerability might become known. You want to scan your production environment for that new known vulnerability. You can't prevent it from landing in production yet, because you didn't know when it was being deployed, but now you do know. So you want to scan. It's not only for vulnerabilities, it's also for wrong configuration. You can use scanning. You can scan your AWS account for wrong configurations. And the third pillar is forensics, sorry. So forensics is looking what happened after the fact. Something went wrong. Somebody was able to access data they shouldn't have access to, and they've downloaded some user data. You want to know which user data exactly, when did they access it, how did they access it, and find out if you can close that loophole. So you need all three. So you want to prevent things from landing into production. If some unknown thing has landed in production and it's now an unknown vulnerability, you want to scan for it. And then forensics, you want to look and be able to search after the fact what has happened, so you can take the right mitigations. So what can you do about these things? Well, AWS has a cloud security page. It's aws.amazon.com/products/security, and it has more than 25 services. So one of them is IAM, but we're not going to focus on that. We'll focus on 4 of these today. So the 4 are AWS CloudTrail, AWS Config, Security Up, and Guard2T. So CloudTrail basically tracks everything happening in your Amazon account. Config, but from a user's perspective and which APIs were used. AWS Config tracks the same, but from a resource perspective. So it will give us the history of resources, and we'll be able to write rules on resources to check if the configuration is correct. AWS Security Hub contains a list of predefined rules for AWS config and is the security hub for everything on AWS. So almost all other security services send their findings to AWS Security Hub, so you can have one overview of everything going on security-wise in your account. And then we have Amazon Guard Duty. Amazon Guard Duty is doing intelligent threat detection on your account, so it's detecting if something fishy is going on your account. First of all, we'll look at AWS CloudTrail. AWS CloudTrail is typically used for forensics. So it tracks all user activity, everything that is going on that users do, but also all API usage. So if a Spark job, for example, has written things to S3, you can also track that. So it's not only users, but also systems interacting with AWS. And it's the basis for a lot of other services. It's very important when doing forensics. And if you don't have it enabled on your AWS account, I highly suggest you to do so right after this webinar. You can also use it to scan. You can also scan it yourself, but it's not a service that scans. It's mostly a service that stores the information. But you could use it to do scanning yourself if you want to. What does a CloudTrail event look like? So first of all, we have the event time at the top left. When did something happen? Then the username, who did this? Then the event name, what did he do? And we also have the resource name. So which resource did he interact with? He or she, or it could be, instead of a username, it could be also be an IAM role. So this is like the basic thing that you need. So it's auditing everything on your account. And this is stored in an S3 bucket. You can also store it on CloudWatch. So this is the basis for a lot of things. And it's the basics for the next service. So at the bottom right, you see here AWS config. You can also look at it from, the resource in AWS config from here. So what is AWS config? It's similar to CloudTrail and it uses the same, it starts from the same events, but it focuses more on the resulting resources instead of the raw interactions. So it records the configuration of your resources in AWS. You get a history of all the resources and the current configuration. It also tracks the relationships between resources. For example, an EC2 instance uses a security group. You can see both on the EC2 instance which security group it uses, but also on the security group which EC2 instances use it. It also means that for certain events, you will have two records on the resources. So this is a bit of a more expensive, it's not as cheap as AWS CloudTrail. It can cost you a bit more, but then it allows you to do the next thing that is very interesting, and it's allowing you to create rules on these resources. So you have three types of rules: AWS managed rules, which are the easiest to use because you don't have to configure anything. The Guard custom policy rules. So they have a language or a DSL in which you can write policies, and basically you have to write it as fails or succeeds. If it succeeds, it's a correct config. If it fails, you detect a failed config. And then the hardest thing that you can do is write your own Lambda rules. I highly recommend you to start in the order that I presented them because they go from easiest to manage to the hardest to manage. We at the moment only use AWS managed rules created by the next service we'll be talking about, AWS Security Hub. So what does it look like? So remember that we looked at a CloudTrail event to create an S3 bucket. So this is the other view. Now we're looking at the timeline of the S3 bucket itself. And so you can see at which point in time, which CloudTrail event was triggered. You can also, if you pop it open, click the resulting, check the resulting configuration, and you can also see all the rules that have been applied and checked for this resource. You can immediately see that there are 4 failing and 10 resources applied. If we click on the rules, then we can see all the resources that have been applied. So they all start with Security Hub, these rules. That is because we used predefined rules from AWS Security Hub. which is the next service we'll be talking about. And I can highly recommend you to not start writing or configuring your own rules, but use these from AWS Security Hub to start with. So AWS Security Hub, it has 3 sets of automated controls at the moment. We have 2 enabled. So they have SIS AWS Foundations Benchmark Standard, the AWS Foundational Security Best Practices Standard, and the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. That was a whole mouthful. But so basically, I recommend you to enable the first 2 of these. The first one, SIS AWS Foundations Benchmark Standard, focuses more on the basic setup of your AWS account. So it focuses on the root user, that it has hardware two-factor authentication, also that it's properly secured. It focuses on password policies for IAM users. It focuses on setting up CloudTrail, so it focuses on the basis of your account. It has a set of 40 rules, I believe. The next one has a set of about almost 160 rules, but it focuses on the basic AWS services. So S3, elastic load balancing, EC2 instances, SQS configuration, SNS configuration, and it focuses on using the best practices there. So making sure that everything is encrypted, etc. If you turn these on, it will result in AWS config rules being populated for you. So that means with just a few clicks of a buttons, you have rules configured that are the best practices according to AWS, and then you can start tackling the non-compliant resources. Second thing it does is also aggregates all security findings from other services, but that is for me a bit less important at this point in time. So what does it look like in AWS? So this is a screenshot from one of our non-production accounts that has a little bit of a less score. Our production account for Conveyor has a 97% score, but there's a lot less to show you regarding these rules. So you can see we enabled the foundational security best practices and the foundations benchmark. And you can see the amount of passed rule checks and the amount of failed checks and a percentage. Wouldn't focus too much on the security score itself. It's good if it's high, of course, but if you click on one of these, then you get a list of failed and succeeded controls. And I would focus a bit more on that here. I don't know if it's clear, might be a bit small, but so we have different columns. So we have a failed or succeeded column here, but we also have a severity column here. So if you start with this, I would highly suggest to do it in the order of severity of fixing those. First start with fixing the critical ones, then the high ones, then the medium, then the low ones. I think fixing the critical and high issues, I would definitely do that as soon as possible or put some focus on there. I would postpone the medium and the lows, so you're not only focusing on security the whole time, but you also can deliver some business value and you can mix it a bit. You also see that we have 173 enabled and 1 disabled, so you can also disable some rules. AWS gives you some guidelines towards that if you look in the documentation of AWS Security Hub. But yeah, so I said 150 before, it's like 174 controls. That's quite a lot. It's quite a lot of things to check. So just do it in order of severity if you start with it. And then they all get a title. So hardware multi-factor authentication should be enabled for the root user. Most of these make sense. They're very straightforward and very important. Also, S3 buckets should prohibit public read access. Most of the times the title makes sense if you know which AWS resource it is talking about. I've had issues with some of these rules that they weren't clear and that I needed to spend some investigation. But if you click on one of these, for example, the S3 buckets should prohibit public read access. It gives you a bit of a better overview. So then you get a list of all checks that have been executed on which resources. And so you can see that our Datafy CP artifact staging S3 bucket fails this rule. If you then want to know how to fix it, they have at the top right, they have a link to the remediation instructions. They also have a description here, but if you click on the remediation instructions, they give you a lot more information on how to fix these issues. So they give you some explanation on what the control does and why it is important. So in this use case, they say, for example, there are some use cases that need your S3 bucket to be readable from the internet. However, those situations are rare. To ensure integrity and security of your data, your S3 buckets should not be publicly readable. And this is a good recommendation. So sometimes you do need a public S3 bucket. For example, for Conveyor, we have a CLI. We store that on a public S3 bucket. Anyone can download that. That is not a problem. However, most of the times you don't ever want this. I think it's been a nightmare of some companies that they detected that an S3 bucket was set with public read access by accident. That is problematic. And so most of the rules are like this. And when you get to medium or low, so for sure, the critical and the highs are very straightforward and very easy to understand. If they become medium or low, you might debate them a bit. Also, sometimes they give you good use cases for a certain rule where they say, hey, but this use case is the exception. And they also give you a remediation here. So they give you an explanation on how to remediate it with a couple of steps. Typically, we have to translate this to Terraform or CloudFormation. But so if you know, S3 bucket is a service that a lot of people know well, so it might be easy to figure this out and translate this into Terraform or CloudFormation. With others, it can take a bit longer. But so it might take a bit of research to completely understand it, but I often think that the description is rather good. Then the next service that I highly recommend to turn on, because it's also rather cheap. It's cheap. It's not too expensive. And you get a 30-day free trial when you start it. So you can, for 30 days, get it for free. And then after a week, they'll give you an estimation of how much it would cost you every month. So this one does intelligent threat detection. For this, it uses Amazon S3 logs, AKS audit logs, CloudTrail logs, VPC flow logs, and DNS query logs. And it also scans your EBS disks for malware. So an example of a thing that it can detect is, the VPC flow logs can be used to detect some of these. And so VPC flow logs are all the interactions happening on your VPC, so on your network on AWS, they are stored in the VPC flow log. So if in EC2 instance, a virtual machine contacts the internet, that will be stored in VPC flow logs. It's also not too expensive. Everything is stored on S3 typically. So I think it's fine. But what they can detect with this is if, for example, a virtual machine contacts a known Bitcoin miner IP address, then this could mean that you have Bitcoin miner malware on your EC2 instance. So they flag this as a high security risk. You might have something on your EC2 instance that's not okay. For S3, they also detect things being public or your public S3 bucket being used from the Tor network, etc. So yeah, these are quite useful. Also, what they do with EBS disks is quite nice. So with EBS, they can scan the volumes of your virtual machines. They do it by taking a snapshot of your virtual machine. This has no performance impact, and then they scan that snapshot. So this has no performance impact for you in production, and they can scan that snapshot for known malwares. So they could detect a ransomware malware being dormant on your machine or a Bitcoin miner being on your machine. They can detect that, and they will give you the scan results of that. All in all, this is a rather cheap service, but so you can use it free for 30 days and then see After 7 days, you can see the cost for you. What does such a finding look like? So it's a bit of, so this is, I think we enabled this months and months ago. I don't remember exactly, but so you see only 3 archived findings. So it's not a spammy service by any means, but it can help you a lot. And one of the things I just clicked to open is a Tor IP caller. So someone from the Tor network tried to access a public S3 bucket, the one where we have the CLI stored for Conveyor, and tried to test out and probe our security defense on that. So they flag this as, hey, watch out, maybe someone is trying to figure out how they can contact your AWS account. So what I recommend is you can, if you enable this, you of course need to look at these findings. So either as developer or architect or someone from operations, you make them look at it every morning, or you can integrate this with your ticketing system. So automatically tickets will be created from these findings. I would recommend the second one, but if you don't have it set up yet, just go look at it every morning. Maybe if it's enabled for a team, they can look at it during the stand-up or something. But so it's a rather easy service to enable. It's not too expensive. So what can you do? What I would recommend is start like this. You start with AWS CloudTrail because it's the basic service for figuring out if somebody did something wrong in your account, which data did they access. So enable that one first. It's also it's not too expensive as a service. So I would do that. Secondly, I would enable Amazon Guard Duty. It's also not too expensive, and it can help you figure out if there is some malware on one of your machines. And it can detect malware, it can detect misbehaving components or virtual machines in your network, etc. It's also not too expensive, but you have to follow up. You have to have a process in place of following up the findings. After that, I would enable AWS Config and Security Hub. They go a bit hand in hand. So enable AWS Config so you have that overview of all your resources, and then enables the 2 sets of controls we talked about on AWS Security Hub. And they will help you configure your Amazon or your AWS account correctly. The AWS Config can be a bit more expensive. So that's how we did it. That's how we used that. AWS Config will also tell you to enable CloudTrail and Guard Duty and how to set it up. So you could look at the documentation of that to get some help. So that's basically what I wanted to share with you guys today. Hopefully this will help you on getting started. If you need any help with this at Data Minded, we can of course help you, so don't hesitate to reach out. But hopefully this helps you to get started. Are there any questions from the audience? You can ask them in the chat. Okay, no questions? I see Nayan posting something. Yeah, so Kranti, know that this is just a small part of all security services that they offer, and this is the ones I would start with if I had to set up an AWS account again. But there are a lot more. I'm gonna investigate them too. So regarding automation, what do you exactly mean with automation? Because we use Terraform to automate the whole. So we use Terraform to automate the whole setup of our account. Automated remediation, well, we typically look at what AWS config, the rules spit out, and we change our Terraform. Because there is no automated remediation on that at the moment. For Amazon Guard Duty, there's also no automated remediation at the moment. It's been a while since I've used Elastic Beanstalk, to be honest. But what AWS provides you, if you use an application load balancer, for example, they provide some security features by default on the application load balancer. And on the application load balancer, you can also enable AWS WAF, which can help you protect against DDoS accounts, etc. So if you use Elastic Beanstalk to host an API and you use application load balancer in front of it to load balance on top of Beanstalk, I would highly recommend enabling AWS WAF for DDoS protection and protection against other things. But if you want more information, Ali, don't send me a message on LinkedIn, and then we can chat a bit about it. Okay. If there are no more questions, I will give, yes, very smart. I'll give my LinkedIn. So this is my LinkedIn profile. You can add me as a connection, and then we can chat, or we can set up a phone call or something. Okay. I think, unless there are any other questions, I think that's it for the webinar. I hope you've all learned a bit on how to better protect your AWS account, and see you next time.